Hey, I'm Anthony Romano, and I'm going to tell you in this video if carbs are bad for you or not. And if you know my videos, you know I've been doing the keto diet for the past 8 years, so you probably think that I'm just going to be putting carbs on blast in this video. But here's the thing, carbs are not bad for you in and of themselves, okay? And I'm going to explain this. And one thing that actually really gets under my skin is that people on YouTube, especially when they haven't done a keto diet before, they think that people who do keto dieting just think carbs are the worst, the devil. They think carbs is like the worst thing in the world.
Don't you remember what your mama told you about
Carbs.
I remember, mama. I don't ever want you to associate with
Carbohydrates.
Why not, Mama?
because
Carbs.
are the devil.
And that's not true at all. In fact, I'd argue that people who do keto know how to use carbs strategically, or at least if you watch my videos, you do. And essentially, carbs are not bad for you in and of themselves, and I'm going to explain this in this video because the key to carb usage is it's all about disposal of extra glucose in your body and your bloodstream. So, and also it comes down to the source of the carbs, how processed it was and how tampered with it was by modern agriculture. So things like pesticides, other, processed oils that would make it into the food, and again, other processed sugars that are artificially designed to create excess dopamine spikes in your brain to make the food addictive, things of that nature. This video is talking about the carbs that are already devoid of that. So, example, if you can find a Belgian chocolate bar type of carb, not like a, Snickers bar that has a billion canola oils and high fructose corn syrups and all that other BS. But I'm going to explain this in this video. Okay, subscribe also to me and like this video. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the 3 screens that you have to look at a food through in order to determine if it is a good carb for you or a bad carb for you. Okay, so here's the thing. Most people have a tendency of looking at a carb source and only paying attention to the carbs in it. So example, donuts. People refer to that as this is carbs, right? They're only paying attention to the fact that it is a carb source. But you have to pay attention to 3 things. You have to pay attention to what kind of carbs are in this, so the glycemic index, which is basically how quickly the sugar is going to enter your bloodstream, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. Then you also have to so that's actually considering the carb source itself. Now, the other 2 screens are about how the carb was tampered with, and also the other ingredients that may be problematic when combined with carbs, okay? And if you know the type of carb itself, that will also give you some indication as to how problematic it is when you combine the 2. So, the glycemic index, this is how quickly the carb is going to hit your bloodstream. So on the glycemic index, this simple example, broccoli is very fibrous and very slow digesting. You could have 100 carbs from broccoli and it'd be so fibrously dense that it would pass through your gut and probably not be a very pleasant feeling. But essentially, you will not get a blood sugar raise out of broccoli. You can eat 100 grams of carbs worth, it's not going to affect your body like 100 grams of donuts will. And guess what? Even 30 grams of sugar from donuts, is going to affect your blood sugar a lot more than broccoli will, 100 grams of broccoli, because of how quickly it hits your bloodstream. This is the glycemic index, how quickly digesting the sugar is. And basically, to give you a short answer of the glycemic index, because you probably should look it up, you can look up any single food, like any type of sugar, and see how quickly it digests. Essentially, if you have dextrose, or basically the quickest digesting sugar out there, dextrose and maltodextrin, a lot of foods are sweetened with that because it creates a higher reward response because you're getting this quick energy, okay? And your brain likes that because that's an indication that you're going to survive till tomorrow because you have energy that's so readily available that you can store it, you can use it immediately. It's very valuable in nature. So essentially, this is also why people get addicted to high sugar foods. But that is essentially the carb source itself. But here's the twist. High glycemic carbs are not necessarily bad. They digest very quickly and they can raise your blood sugar. And if you are somebody who is, metabolically compromised, you have insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, things like that, or you have some sort of metabolic dysfunction, then higher glycemic carbs may be a problem for you. There's a very good chance that your body will not use them effectively. And, the more overweight you are, that's a good indication. And also they're probably more mentally addictive as well, but that's a side note consideration. Now, here's the thing. If you are a healthy person, you're having high glycemic carbs, if you can dispose of that carb, if you can use it, if you either have, room in your muscle glycogen stores or you are a very active person, then you will probably face little to no problems from consuming that carbohydrate. So, by that reasoning, high glycemic carbs are not necessarily all bad. It's all about your ability to use them. Now, of course, excess amounts of high glycemic carbs can put stress on basically your arteries for transferring this glucose. It can basically put pressure. It can raise your blood pressure. It can create extra damage to your blood vessels. And this is something you would, again, only experience if you are somebody who's already at some sort of metabolic, dysfunction stage in your life. So essentially, if you're already in bad shape, this stuff is a problem. But the carbs in and of themselves are not a problem if you can use them or if you're somebody who's already active. So bam, there's the first layer to screening out carbs. Even if they're high glycemic carb, high digesting speed sugar, if you can use them effectively and you don't go over your liver glycogen store, then you won't gain any fat. Okay, as a side note too. Because here's the thing, your body can store about 2,000 calories worth of carbs in it. So that's between your muscle stores and also from your liver glycogen. So that just basically is your backup team. It's your bench of reserves for carbs. And once you go over 2,000 calories worth of carb, you're more likely to add body fat, and store that carb as fuel on your body. Now here's the thing. Basically, if you are using that and burning it off, you're not going to run into that problem. So let's get into the next two layers. Now, ironically, these next two layers are far more prevalent, far more common, and affect the food supply we have nowadays much more than the actual glycemic density of carbs themselves. So let me get into this. The way the food was processed and the other accompanying problems, so the other accompanying oils, the other accompanying kryptonite that might be in there, those are far bigger problems because a lot of food, especially a lot of carb sources, they're planted. They're typically crops. They're typically planted. It could be corn. It could be wheat. It could be a lot of things. But a lot of these monocropped, grains and carb sources are exposed to pesticides. There could be, for a lot of these foods, there could be GMOs, they could be genetically modified. There could be a lot of different problems that come into play. But the most common one, and the most problematic one, is herbicides and pesticides. And glyphosate is one of the most common pesticides that's used in the West. And in general, glyphosate can even mess with your collagen network because that's what the glycine molecule is attached to, glyphosate. So essentially, these pesticides are problematic for your health, and they've been shown to create inflammation. And we absolutely know that they mess with brain health and even with many other organs, with skin health. But there's, these findings are just starting to be unraveled. Okay, but here's the thing. Having a lot of these carb sources that are just drenched in these pesticides is a big problem. And this also comes down to the carb source. So granted, are you going to lose your mind if you have a donut, which is probably, exposed to pesticide at some point? No, you shouldn't lose any sleep over that. However, if you're having food like this all the time, if you're having a bowl of cereal every morning that was doused in pesticides, you will absolutely notice an improvement in your brain function and your overall probably happiness as well if you cut that bowl of cereal out. So example, it's not the glycemic density or the glycemic load of the sugar within the cereal. That's the problem here, because if you can handle it, if you burn that off, you're going to be fine. Now we're starting to look at the other factors. We're looking at the pesticides. We're looking at other kryptonite that is being exposed to the carb source. So when we look at the other accompanying oils and the other accompanying kryptonite, I'm going to explain this in a moment as well. But I just want you to remember, a lot of these foods, it comes down to the herbicides, pesticides, and the treatment of the processing of these foods. So a lot of times as well, when you have other carb sources, like example, milk, a lot of people, milk is predominantly sugar and lactose and carb, but there's also protein in there. There's also a little bit of fat, but milk itself is the carbier part of the actual dairy from the cow. So example, milk is pasteurized, and for a lot of people, the pasteurization process eliminates lactase, which is an enzyme that breaks down lactose. So little factors like this in processing make it indigestible for certain people. So this is much more common. Things of that nature, of the processing and handling of the food itself, are far more problematic. So how do you avoid that? Well, you get... Okay, my lamp just fell. you get your hands on better quality carb sources. You get your hands on the chocolate bar that is natural and, from Belgium or something cool like that. You don't get your hand on the Snickers bar because, again, now we're getting into the area of the other additives that can be a problem. So let's get into the additives, okay? So you avoid the pesticides, you get your organic vegetables, your organic grains. And here's the thing. Grains will carry other indigestible proteins. They will carry gluten. They will carry essentially WGA, wheat germ agglutinin. Basically, there's other problematic proteins that can be packaged in these carbs because it's simply a part of the carb itself. Even with oats, there's a reason why people soak oats overnight, because the phytic acid in the oats needs to be basically eliminated. And the only way you can do this is by soaking the oats, because the phytic acid itself is what actually makes the protein indigestible. And essentially these other anti-nutrients have to be handled. Anti-nutrients are things that bind to minerals in your body, and they're commonly found in carb sources or wheat or grains, because if you think about plants in nature, they want to defend themselves as well, and they can't fight, so they have to discourage the predators from eating them, which is also why foods like soy will contain phytoestrogens or other compounds that are meant to discourage animals from eating them because they want to survive as well. So a lot of these foods basically are designed, and they have evolved to make themselves undesirable, or at least less desirable, for being consumed all the time. So example, if you are consuming carb sources that are inflammatory, whether it's gluten, whether it is other lectins or anti-nutrients. Lectins basically are another anti-nutrient that is commonly found in grains and other planted foods. Essentially, a lot of those things, you can avoid those problems if you simply get higher quality versions of the food. If you get the organic food, if you get the overnight oats, okay, things of those nature, there are ways around those problems. And example, having unsprouted food, having food that isn't perfectly handled, having oats that isn't perfectly handled every now and then is not a problem, okay? I mean, I'm pretty sure every time I have oats in my life, I never soak them overnight, okay? That's just way too tedious for me. But I'm not consuming oats on a, everyday basis anyways. So the point is, if you can work your way around those problems, if you are certain that you are not allergic to gluten, even though most people have an inflammatory reaction to gluten, if you are absolutely certain that you can digest dairy, all those things, if you're certain that you can get by with, the unorganic version of the food, then power to you, okay? But what I'm saying is there are safeguards that you should have in place. And for the most part, the simple answer is to switch to more digestible carb sources. So example, the white rice, white bread versus whole grain bread. A lot of whole grain bread is exposed to mold toxins in the processing. A lot of whole grain bread is simply combination of grains that didn't sell well in the first place, or they weren't good enough to be distributed to a wholesaler, and they basically crammed a lot of different breads of different, I don't know what you could call it, ripeness, I guess, of different preparation levels, and they combined it together to make a product for a higher profit margin. And guess what? Whole grain bread has a higher glycemic index, so it creates a higher dopamine response in your brain, and you get a higher blood sugar spike from it. Now, granted, most grains would have more fiber, and the soil was much more mineral rich hundreds of years ago. But the point I'm getting at is, it's not simply the glycemic index, but this is again just something you have to be considerate of. So making simple switches to white rice instead of brown, right? Because there's less lectin content, even though there's still a little bit of WGA in white rice, which is wheat germ agglutinin. I don't expect you to remember all these proteins that are problematic. But essentially, once you look at the filter of glycemic index, and then you look at the filter of tampering, and then you look at the filter of other ingredients in the carb source as a whole, this is again your guide here, okay? So I don't expect you to remember WGA. I don't expect you to remember every lectin and every anti-nutrient and the phytic acid, okay? I don't expect you to remember, and the oxalates. I don't expect you to remember all this stuff. But what I do expect you to remember is, write this down, glycemic index, okay? Processing and other ingredients. Write those three things down, because those three things are the guide. So let's get into other ingredients, okay? So the processing, the easy way around that is by getting organic and perhaps, soaking your oats, or if you consume them all the time, or just getting better quality oats that are probably already handled in a way that has avoided mold toxins or phytic acid or any other consideration. Now, other ingredients. This one is actually the most common, okay? This one is the most common besides the pesticides. Now, commonly, think of a chocolate bar, okay? Belgian chocolate bar, it's milk, sugar, cocoa. maybe some butter in there. That is Belgian chocolate bar. Okay? Now granted, you could really microanalyze this and say, oh, well, did the cow that produced the butter and the milk, did they eat crops that were exposed to pesticides? You can go that deep into it. But most people aren't that meticulous, okay? I mean, I'm definitely always considering that because I'm a crazy nerd, but you don't have to do that. Again, the 3 layers, the 3 filters are what you should be focusing on. So, chocolate should be containing milk, butter, cocoa, sugar. That's what it should contain. And even with the sugar being in there, it's totally cool if that is high glycemic sugar, for the most part, right? Assuming you're having these things in moderation. It's not the sugar that's the problem here. The problem comes when you look at a Snickers bar in comparison to that Belgian chocolate bar, and you have canola oil, rapeseed oil, sunflower oil, soy lecithin, perhaps even soy oil. These are vegetable oils. They are processed oils, and they are the worst thing for you. They're essentially closer to lab chemicals than they are to real food. And the reason why is because these are oils that are basically produced from plants, and essentially to sell them and to make them, have a long shelf life, they expose them to heat. Similar to example how the milk on the shelves of grocery stores is pasteurized because it allows it to have a longer selling date, a longer shelf life. So these vegetable oils, because they are exposed to heat, their chemical chain becomes unstable. What that means is the carbon atoms in the chain themselves become basically unpredictable, and your body's not really going to know how to process them. They basically move in a way that makes them not stable because every atom is not filled up with carbon. That is what saturated fats will look like, and this is why you should cook with saturated fats, by the way, for the most part, except for probably cold-pressed olive oil. But even then, don't go too high on the heat with cold-pressed olive oil. But the thing is, those processed oils are commonly packaged with sugar and carb sources, and here's where I'm getting into the practical element here. Okay, so those processed oils, they're a problem, right? They're inflammatory, right? They basically are chemicals. Here's the thing. Your brain is designed to experience bliss when, this is an actual thing, the bliss point, when you combine sugar and fat together. And so basically, because in nature, it's very rare that you would find, like in evolutionary history, it's very rare you would find carb and fat at the same time. And this is 2 fuel sources your body uses. So your body and your brain would give you a massive reward response to this, because it's basically like you struck gold. You know you're going to survive tomorrow. You're probably going to survive till the next week because you're taking in 2 fuel sources at the same time. So if you think about most foods, they don't naturally contain high amounts of sugar and fat at the same time. It's very difficult to think of a food that does. And if one of them does, it's not a very high glycemic source of sugar. Okay, so here's the thing. Even though we know those fats are basically just chemicals, your body's still going to perceive it as fat, and it's going to see the combination of sugar and fat and create a hyper reward response for that. And essentially, it's also from a very high glycemic sugar, which could be a problem if you're already metabolically compromised. And then you have the fat, which is already inflammatory in and of itself, the processed fats, not all fats, okay? But those processed fats and those oils coming together, the hydrogenated oils combined with high glycemic sugars, is a recipe for addictive food and also a cascade of inflammation in your body and oxidative stress. So this is another reason as to why certain carb sources are a problem. And this is a long video, it's not going to be a short video, okay? You knew this when you clicked it. But basically, this is the reason why it's so difficult for people to explain, are carbs bad? Because a lot of times in these studies, it's not just carbs themselves. They're not giving people organic chocolate bars. They're not giving people oats that are always soaked overnight. They're not giving people organic versions of the food. They're not doing these things. So a lot of times sugar might get a bad rap or fat might get a bad rap, but it could be these other extraneous variables that are influencing the results and causing people to have higher inflammation markers, causing them to have higher triglyceride in their blood, higher blood sugar. So a lot of these problems are because of the combination, okay, and the other people on the team, on the roster, okay, the other ingredients. And an extra layer to this is a lot of these sugars are not simply real sugars that happen to digest quickly. They are modified processed sugars that are designed to digest ridiculously quickly so that your brain, again, receives a hyper reward response. The most common one is high fructose corn syrup. So you'll often see corn syrup, you'll see glucose syrup, you'll see fructose syrup, glucose fructose. You'll see those terms. Those all indicate basically processed sugar to the point where it is a syrup that has probably a glycemic index of, the glycemic index is out of 100, by the way, and dextrose is the fastest one, it's about 100. It's basically, some of these processed sugars basically are 50 points ahead of the ceiling for natural sugars. Natural sugars, like dextrose, cap out at about 100, right? And realistically, dextrose is still processed from potatoes or from soy, it could even be, or corn. So basically, even dextrose, it has a natural source. The thing is, this glycemic table is being just slammed with these artificial sugars that have speeds of digestion and reward response way higher than anything normal. So it's all about the combination of these problems that we could run into. And the way you avoid this is by looking at the label of the food. Okay, look at the label of the food. See if there's canola oil. See if there's, high fructose corn syrup. Okay, those are essentially the problems that you will find within carbs. And again, I'll add in a fourth screen here. It's still technically part of other ingredients, okay, that aren't carbs. But this is where we have the excitatory neurotoxins, or the other ingredients that are designed to make a food addictive. So MSG, aspartame, these are things that are added to foods to give your brain a higher glutamate reaction, so that essentially you find a food very rewarding. And this is essentially basically an ingredient to make anything taste delicious. Okay, I've made jokes in other videos that you could get a piece of dirt and put MSG in it and aspartame and it would taste better than dirt. Okay, so literally these are ingredients that are added to make the food addictive, and they are inflammatory. Okay, I've shown in other videos that there are studies where MSG causes problems in rats, and basically aspartame can cause cancer in mice or something like that. Go to my other videos to watch it. But essentially, these are things we know are inflammatory and cause problems. And essentially, if you can just focus on eliminating processed foods, you can get most of this shit out of your way anyways. Okay, so that's kind of the main summation of this video. If you just focus on eating organic food and getting your carb sources in a controlled manner, and whenever you find yourself on a carb loop where you are craving carbs and you're addicted to carbs and you can't live your life without them, that's an indication that you need to start fasting and doing ketogenic dieting. Because our bodies every year, okay, if you think about thousands of years ago, in the wintertime, it is very hard to acquire carbs. Most of them don't grow in the winter, which is why our body and our metabolism is meant to be seasonal, just like everything else in life. Day and night, chaos and order, summer, winter, okay? All those things are seasonal, and there's a polarity between them, and this is what our metabolism is meant to do as well. So, again, this is another reason as to why, you can assess for yourself, are carbs bad for me at this current moment? Okay, and when I say carbs, I mean like the glycemic index consideration, the quality of the sugar itself. Because like I said, it's only really a problem if you're not capable of disposing of it. And that's actually a quote from Peter Attia, I believe, as well. Okay, welcome to the second half of this video. Basically, as I was editing this, I decided that the purpose of this video is going to be slightly different. I want this to be the only video you ever have to watch on carbs so you can understand them entirely. So essentially, what I want you to do with this is let this video last, listen to it on double speed if you have to. It's a long video, but this is the only video you ever need to see on carbs to understand them completely. So I'm going to get into some of the other topics that I was reserving only for books I read on this, and basically explain them very briefly. So it will add to the total time of the video, but this is some very important stuff that's going to really enhance your understanding of carbs. There's literally like 14, 15 points I have here, and I'm going to run through them quick fire so you understand absolutely everything. So let's get into the first one. This is AGEs, Advanced Glycation End Products. This happens when you mix basically carbs and fats together in a cooked environment. It also can happen from when you mix proteins in with carbs or fats and cook them, but at the same time, this comes from mixing carbs and fats, which is already one of the, cardinal sins of fitness, if you will. So advanced glycation end products are very problematic for the body, and they again come from mixing carbs with other foods. They can be very inflammatory, and they have a lot of problems because they cause glycated proteins to be in your body. So the second point here is too much insulin on a long-term basis is very bad for you. This sounds so I guess basic, but this is a serious thing. One of the primary dictators of longevity is low and stable insulin. So if you don't know how insulin works in relation to carbs, carbohydrates spike insulin the most. Protein can also raise insulin, and fat can have a very subtle insulin effect, but carbohydrates are by far the primary spiker of insulin. And this is why essentially type 2 diabetics have the problems they do, because they're used to having sky-high insulin levels all the time. Now, too much insulin is obviously problematic, it's inflammatory, but the big thing here is that all centenarians, all people who have lived longer than 100 years, or are currently living longer than 100 years, are people who have had good blood sugar control. There are people who have had relatively low and stable insulin. And you need insulin at certain times. You need insulin to build muscle. Of course, this can happen simply from protein, but at the same time, keeping insulin low on a regular basis or lower is something that is going to enhance your longevity, and basically is one of the primary indicators of long lifespan. So the way you can kind of achieve that is by either moderate carb consumption. So again, keeping things in moderation. A lot of studies have shown that when people are at calorie maintenance, they're not going to encounter a lot of the problems that carbohydrates and insulin can pose. So that is one side of the coin. But as I always say, there's two sides of the coin for fitness. There is the quantitative side, the calorie controlled side, or you can look at the qualitative side, which focuses more on the hormones, okay? You can look at it like consequence based or input based, okay? And when you do the more keto type perspectives with the fasting approaches, you're focusing on affecting your hormones directly rather than a total calorie total. So again, you can achieve stable insulin from simply eating carbs to your liking, but remaining at appropriate calorie amounts. However, that's easier said than done, because carbs can be appetite provoking because they're an energy source. They're not something that is primary for your body. Protein, which literally means primary in Greek, is the building blocks of your body, and your body needs proteins. So that's why they're partly one of the more satiating macro groups, because what happens is your body needs protein and you will be hungry until you achieve enough protein. So eating energy sources is not going to keep you fully satiated. Granted, fats are a little bit more satiating than carbs because they're higher calorie, but at the end of the day, eating carbs, especially in absence of other macros, is going to raise your appetite and make this harder. However, if you do hit an appropriate calorie amount, you are going to be fine technically from a stable insulin perspective. But that a lot of people don't even achieve that with the calorie amounts unless they're very active individuals, in which case they're probably already relatively insulin sensitive. However, the key to fixing that is hopping into a keto approach or a fasting oriented approach. That will absolutely improve your insulin sensitivity if you're already at a point where you're kind of compromised, and simply eating carbs but maintaining under a calorie total every day is not realistic for you. So that's another reason why keto and fasting is the way to kind of fix the problem. Even if you're not fully certain that you have it, you can optimize insulin sensitivity by using some of those approaches. And it will come in a much more intuitive manner, because keto is simply the homeostatic mechanism that your body uses to downregulate hunger, to downregulate appetite signals. Because, as I said before, the nature of our seasonal metabolism is that during a large part of the year, carbs are not available. So our body had to naturally downregulate the hormones and the processes so that this became intuitive and easy for you. Okay, so insulin sensitivity and the problems of overinsulin production. So keto will, of course, boost that insulin sensitivity, so will fasting. But again, you can still achieve this through moderate carb consumption if you want to be, very regulatory over your eating habits, which is fine. Now, minimizing gluten lectins is stuff I've already spoke about, but minimizing the anti-nutrients is something that you have to be aware of even when you have the organic and clean carbs. This is something where, having a controlled amount of carb consumption is key. Overdoing these things is going to cause lots of problems. But the best way to do that is by, in my opinion, having some sort of keto or fasting baseline and then using your carbs strategically around that. My preferred method is carb backloading, which is basically I will do a keto diet for, all the time basically, but essentially a lot of people have integrated this in a much more, I guess you could say, balanced way for their lifestyle by doing keto for a span of a couple months, and then that resets sort of your insulin sensitivity. It resets your sensitivity to carbs so you're not addicted to them all the time in this perpetual cycle of eating them. And then basically you can time your carbs around workouts. And essentially that is a far more effective way to actually intake carbs without any of the negative consequences that constant carb consumption can cause, mostly related to those insulin problems. Okay? Now, combining fat and sugar is actually a serious problem. So again, this video is mostly on carbs, but when you combine fat and sugar, you're actually going to increase the likelihood of de novo lipogenesis, which is basically the creation of new body fat. So of all the things science has shown in nutritional studies, because there's a lot of debate on those things, the number one thing that we do know is true is mixing carbs and fats is a recipe for inflammatory problems, oxidative stress, and gaining fat. That is one thing all different perspectives can agree on, because we know mixing those two fuel sources leads to problems. It leads to fat gain. And that's another reason why I take the approach of this sort of double-sided coin, that you can either practically implement an approach to avoid that by looking at your calorie total, your total energy, the total numbers, or you can do it by simply focusing on these hormonal approaches. But granted, minimizing the mixing of carbs and fats is key. And this is something that will lead to better blood sugar control, better triglyceride, and of course the downregulation of de novo lipogenesis. So this is something that you absolutely want to be aware of, and it's something that was worth adding into this video because, again, part of the problems that people attribute to carbohydrate consumption are simply from carbohydrate consumption in the presence of fat. That's simply what it is. So part of the problem is when it's mixed with fat as a food source. So, of course, keto can protect you from that sort of problem, but so can calorie control. Technically, when calories are at maintenance level or they're not in a surplus, even if you do mix carbs and fats, you might not run into as many problems. If somebody does a keto diet, on the other hand, but they're eating shitloads of food, you can still run into de novo lipogenesis. However, again, these two sides of the coin balance each other out. Either you keep your calories maintained, or you keep the hormonal side of the coin under control and you aren't spiking your insulin all the time with carb meals. Okay? So those are the two approaches to handle this. However, in my opinion, I prefer to reset the insulin sensitivity first with keto approaches and basically have keto be some sort of, backbone of your year, and you hop in and out whenever you like. Keto is a tool. I don't try to look at it dogmatically, and that's why I said in the beginning of this video, carbs are not necessarily bad. They're a tool for you, just like keto is. So, now, of course, as I said before, carbs are not necessarily satiating. This is because they're an energy source and that can make them appetite provoking. So this is something where, again, you want to time your carbs appropriately. And another way to further time things even more efficiently is I do not recommend having carbs first thing in the morning without any other macro group present. Of course, you can do that and it'll probably be efficient for some sort of bulking method, but it is going to cause a large insulin spike in the morning. And if you've ever seen my carb backloading videos, you know that setting that insulin spike high in the morning is going to turn off fat burning. It's going to downregulate how much you're actually able to use fat metabolism. So again, that could be beneficial in a bulking context, but again, it's not something you want to be doing regularly because some of those other problems associated with high insulin all the time. Chances are, if you're somebody who does start off the day with that, like a big fruit smoothie or something, you're probably hungry quite frequently. And it could be from the lack of protein and fats in there to blunt that blood sugar and insulin spike, because again, other macros will blunt the blood sugar and insulin spike. But at the end of the day, it's not a good idea. This is where these sort of timing strategies of carb consumption are very important, because before workout or after workout are best. And starting off the day with only carbs is generally not a good idea. So that's another practical takeaway of this video. Starting off the day with pure carbs is generally not a good habit, even though it might not lead to fat storage, even though it might not lead to even, it might not even be somebody who's metabolically dysregulated, okay? At the end of the day, it's just a better idea to minimize and use properly. Like I said before, carbs are not something that we would have had in abundance until the agricultural revolution. So this is not something that humans would have been starting off their days with from thousands of years of ancestral history. So, on that note, this can also raise your HbA1c, which is basically the glycated protein in your bloodstream. One way to look at HbA1c is that it is the long-term blood sugar. Okay, so if you ever get your blood tested, you will see your blood sugar, your fasting blood sugar, okay? And if it's very high, chances are you're diabetic or pre-diabetic. But if it's, relatively low or moderate, you're probably an athletic person. If it's very low and contained, even in the presence of athletic and activities regularly, you're probably somebody who's doing lots of fasting or keto. Now, with the HbA1c, the glycated proteins in the bloodstream, starting off the day with that high carb meal without any other macros to blunt that blood sugar spike and that insulin spike is a surefire way to raise your HbA1c. This causes more glycation in the blood and basically more glycated proteins in the blood and essentially more problems that I was explaining in the earlier parts of this video. So again, this doesn't mean that it has to be dogmatic and you have to never have a carb meal for breakfast. On that note as well, mixing carbs and proteins is not the best for your digestive environment. Carbs require a more alkaline environment to be digested, and proteins require a more acidic environment to be digested. So mixing the two is often problematic, and I have entire videos explaining that this is one surefire way to misdigest your food and not make as many gains, okay? So that's a surefire problem right there. However, as far as overall blood glucose control goes, that is something that you should be concerned about, maintaining stable blood sugar throughout the day and not having it be volatile. But a surefire way to make it volatile is to start off the day with a high blood sugar meal, pure carbs, okay? And that will also raise your HbA1c, which is a problem, and it's associated with many inflammatory conditions in the body. So, on that note, willpower and mood are almost entirely regulated by blood sugar. I have an entire video on willpower, and it's from a book by Roy Baumeister that I read called Willpower, where basically it goes through a large series of studies on that basically prove that your willpower moment to moment is heavily correlated with your blood sugar at that respective time. So if you want to be in control of how you feel and not have your mood be affected by external or by internal problems, the surefire way to do that is to gain control of your blood sugar, which is one of the considerations you should think about when we're talking about the amount of carbs in your diet. Of course, like I said before, you're not going to run into too much extra fat gain. You're not going to run into too much excess inflammatory problems if your calories are appropriate, if you're eating appropriate amounts of food that are not going to create excess. However, at the same time, blood sugar control is not necessarily correlated to that. You cannot fix broken blood sugar. Even if somebody eats only Snickers bars every single day, and that's their whole diet, even if they have the willpower to control their calorie consumption, which would be heavily affected by their volatile blood sugar, that person might not gain weight if they're eating appropriate calories. But the main problem is here, their mood will be volatile. Their willpower will be subject to whatever blood sugar rating they're at a current moment. So this is kind of the area where we get into more the hormonal side, because total quantitative measurements cannot they can't veto out the hormonal problems you run into. And by that same token, the hormonal approaches are still subject to the limits of the quantitative approaches. So again, you could eat keto all day long and have low insulin, but if you have 12,000 calories every single day, you're probably going to gain weight, because again, the hormonal sides cannot veto out these sort of total quantitative limits. And that's my approach that I preach based on my interpretations of many of the data out there. So the way you can figure this shit out is get a blood test and look at your HbA1c and look at your fasting blood glucose. This is the part of the video that's actually giving you something tangible to take away, because most people will talk about certain topics that they probably didn't even research that heavily, unless they're a doctor or something like that, where they actually did do the research or are familiar with it. But I'm trying to give you something that you can take home and actually use to assess your own carb tolerance and how much you basically are in need of certain approaches. So get a blood test. If your blood sugar is high in the 7s or something like that, you're basically in pre-diabetes territory. If you're a relatively active person and you have higher blood sugar, it's not always a bad thing, because some athletic people can have higher blood sugar because their body is used to mobilizing glucose when it needs to be ready. But at the same time, you should be operating on as little blood sugar as you can. Now, granted, don't take that and run with it, because the body needs stable glucose to live. If we did not have blood glucose, you'd be dead, okay? So I'm not saying that you need rock bottom blood sugar all the time. I'm saying that you need the ability to use blood sugar efficiently, and the definition of using it efficiently is using as little as possible as best you can every moment. So that basically means you want to minimize it to a point where your body gets better efficiency, okay? And the way you can figure that out is by looking at your HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c, and your fasting blood glucose on a blood test. Even the ranges that are recommended will give you enough insight. It's not like you need me to tell you a certain number, because I don't know you as an individual. Well, I might actually, but I don't know who's watching this. So let's see the other notes we got here. Oh yeah, and if you do have any problems with that HbA1c measurement and the fasting blood glucose, because that's just the bare minimum I can give you here, blood markers. One way that is surefire to fix that problem is starting to do keto or intermittent fasting. Prolonged fasting as well, but that's a more deep dive into the deep end of the pool. The best way to reset insulin sensitivity and blood sugar control is with keto dieting. And this is why most people don't like to do it, because if they are coming from a very high carb diet, a very dysregulated blood sugar control environment, hopping into a diet where they don't consume any carbs or don't get any blood sugar spikes will be undesirable for them. They will not have constant raises of blood sugar, and the first 3 days will suck as your body's adapting. It's that simple, and I say that in many videos. However, after that point, your body will get used to things. It will adjust, and it will keep blood sugar relatively stable. Only minimal spikes after meals. And from there, you don't have to do this forever. You can simply start integrating carbs, and your body will have a better ability to use them. Granted, I know some people are going to say, oh, you can still reset insulin sensitivity by doing a calorie-controlled diet. You can. But that takes far more willpower. And as I already explained, if your willpower is directly related to your blood sugar and your blood sugar is already volatile, good luck with that. Also watch my video on willpower. So, I hope this video has explained everything to you because, as I said, there are ways to integrate this. And on that note, actually, intermittent fasting is one way to basically tap into that fat metabolism. That's why it's gaining so much popularity. But not many people know that intermittent fasting is the younger brother of keto diets. Basically, you are producing ketones, you are stabilizing blood sugar and insulin, you are raising growth hormone when you do intermittent fasting, and you will produce small amounts of ketones while you intermittent fast. Very small, you won't be in nutritional ketosis, but even when you sleep, your body will produce some ketones in small amounts. This is not something that is foreign, it's not something that is problematic for the body, it is a natural process. And this is why we have to become reintegrated with that sort of metabolic history we have in terms of diet, and also why we have to lose the dependence on sugar as a carb source. That is, again, one of the problems that you could run into. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that simply by having carbs you're going to encounter this problem. It's simply a problem that I haven't heard anybody else speak about, and it is pervasive. Many people have it. So this is why, again, you want to make sure you're on top of these things. And if you aren't, a good way to assess this, again, another tangible takeaway, is if you cannot intermittent fast, if you cannot abstain from a meal for if you cannot fast longer than 16 to 18 hours, that's a good indication that you probably don't have the best blood sugar control, and you should start looking into more of these methods, perhaps learning how to fast longer, learning how to do some keto dieting. Again, doesn't mean you have to do those things to be healthy, but it simply means that if you cannot fast longer than 16 hours, you probably don't have the best blood sugar control, and a blood sugar test would reflect that. So, if you do find that you're not as good as the younger brother of keto, that's a good indication to get into keto or fasting of a larger extent, okay? So that is the end of the second part of the video, and I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I'm going to wrap up the video after this clip, after I explain some more points from the earlier chapter of this video, the earlier half of this video, but leave a like. Watch this video. It is a goldmine on carbs, and is the only video I will ever have to make on carbohydrates as a whole. Thank you.
Now back to your regularly scheduled program.
These are the filters you need to screen carbs with, okay? I could go on this topic forever, but I'm writing books about this stuff because I want it to be visible for people and have essentially prescriptive answers for the general public, because these things are difficult to put into short videos, which is why me giving you 3 filters, right, is already taking like 15-20 minutes, okay? So this is the point of this video. Screen your carbs. Are they very high in their actual carbiness? Okay, that's a good way to think of it. Are they very quick digesting sugars, or are they slow? If they're quicker, you have to look inward to yourself. If they're quicker digesting, you have to say, look, am I going to be able to use this? Is this going to put me over 2,000 calories worth of carb that my body can hold? Am I metabolically compromised? Do I have insulin resistance? Am I overweight? Those are considerations for the first one. Now the second one, the second little piggy, is you have to be concerned about the actual problems in the food. Is it exposed to, like, the source of the carbs? So the source we got is exposed to herbicides, pesticides. Is there a high amount of problematic inflammatory proteins or anti-nutrients in the food? And then we also have the third one. And by the way, the way you get over the second one is by getting more organic food and trying to eliminate processed food and picking cleaner starches, picking white bread instead of whole grain, okay? Especially because whole grain is going to contain more lectins. It's going to contain more anti-nutrients that will bind to minerals in your body and prevent you from absorbing them. Number 3 is going to be, the third little piggy, is basically the other ingredients in the carb source. So we got, is there processed inflammatory hydrogenated oils in the food? Is there canola oil, rapeseed oil, any sort of vegetable oil, sunflower, soy oil? Those things are inflammatory in and of themselves because they're closer to lab chemicals than they are to fat and real food. And their chemical chain, their fatty acid chain, is unstable because it's been exposed to such high heat. And this gives it a long shelf life, and that would allow you to basically sell it for a long time and get a higher profit margin for a very low maintenance product, okay? It's basically a monocropped field that they grind up into oil, and then they heat it up, okay? And then there's other things as well. There could be other parts of the food that could be designed to spike dopamine and neurotransmitters in your brain like glutamate to make the food addictive, like MSG, like aspartame. And there could also be sugars themselves that are modified, processed sugars that are designed to give you a addictive response to foods, such as high fructose corn syrup, glucose fructose. Those things are designed to be very mentally rewarding and addictive. And this is again why it's difficult for your body to use that, because it's so quick digesting, and it could put pressure on your blood vessels. Basically, it could damage blood vessels because of how quickly digesting it is. If it's high in fructose content, it could basically create some inflammation in your liver, cause fatty liver. There's a lot of problems you could run into, but these are the 3 filters you have to look at your carb sources through, okay? And I'm capping it at 3. I could get much more, dense with this and detailed, but this is like already a 20-something minute video. So the main point here is, are carbs bad? No, but you have to run them through these 3 screens, okay? And hopefully this has been useful for you. So like the video, subscribe to me right now, and follow my Instagram as well, and leave me some questions. I'll do my best to get back to you. And again, keep in mind, with all this stuff too, it's about total quantity. It's about, are you having way more than you can consume for your body, right? Based on your subjective position, right? In your health and all that. And, these are things that come with natural logic, okay? Are you eating too many calories as well? Are you just overeating? Things of that nature, okay? So, that is it for the video. Thank you for watching. I'm Anthony Romano. Peace.